And welcome back. Let's go ahead and before we move on and do more with our classes, let's take a moment just to make sure we have a good foundation of how we go ahead and create those classes and how we can use them. So I went ahead and created a new project file here and closed out my previous examples, so I'm not going ahead and referencing them. Let's just go ahead and create a new class. And I want this to be the class I'm going to create objects of. So let's just say I'm going to have something that I can create. It could be anything. And that's the nice thing about classes, they can represent anything I want. So let's say I'm going to have it represent a person, for example. All right. And so we say, okay, this person, do I need a main? Well, no, don't click main here because, again, I'm not going to try to have this be the one that's acting, right? This is not my main program here. This is simply just the class that's going to have all the data for it. So I'm going to hit finish. And so we have called class person. I don't necessarily need a scanner class yet for this because I'm not necessarily looking to get information from the user. I'm just going to set up some information. And let's use this based upon what we know and not upon necessarily everything that we're going to need to know later on. So let's think about what could we have for a person class. Well, for example, we know we might need, for example, let's say a name. So let's go ahead and think about that. Okay, name, well, we're going to need a public identifier here. And that's probably going to be a string type. So I'm going to say public string name. Okay, cool. Maybe I can also think about what else could they? Well, they could have an age, right? So let's go ahead and say it's an age. Well, their age is probably going to be identified as an integer, right? Because we usually don't say, like, well, you're unless maybe you're a toddler or something like that. You don't usually say, like, you're 27 and a half years old. You say, well, I'm 27. All right, so we're going to go ahead and use that as an integer here. What other thing could we put here with this person object that are very common? We could get into a whole bunch of things. So we could do things like height, weight, etc. But this will be enough just for us to kind of get started. So we have, of course, a name and an age. Now, if we remember what we looked at in our last class, once we have these variables made, we need some way of, in our main program, knowing what they are. And so what that did is we made a method. And our methods are always going to be, for our purposes right now, public. And so, again, same thing as we have our variables, public, and we're going to put void here, just like we see public static void main string args. And I'm going to go ahead and call it the same method as I did before. I'm going to call it write output. And you could give it a different name, but you always want to give it a name that has meaning. Just like with our variables, we want it to kind of correspond with whatever its role or its purpose is. So I could call this write variables. Could be the same thing. And there's other methods we're going to use later on that are actually better for this. But for now, we're going to stick with this write output method. And all I want to do inside of it is do a system.out.println. And I'm just going to output the person's name and age. All right, so we'll just say the person's name is, and let's just go ahead and do a concatenation with the variable name. And then we'll do, how about we actually just do a new line. And we can say the person's age is, and we'll concatenate in their age. There we go. And it looks like I have one little thing here because I forgot to put a plus sign in there. There we go. And again, one thing I want to point out here in this class is don't forget that these are curly brackets here around your write output. Notice there's no semicolon here or here because the only semicolon is here for my system.out.println statement. I don't need semicolons here because, again, we're going to use curly brackets. Just like when we had like loops or we are using conditionals, we always want to stick to using these curly brackets here. Now, we can use our main program because this is up to the point of where we are kind of at with our new material. So let's go ahead down here back to our package. We're going to right click and let's do a new class. Now this one we can call whatever we want, but I'm just going to call this lab54. And this time we can click, let's create a main method here because this is going to be our main program. And then when it creates finish, there it is. And all I'm going to do is, let's say, I'm going to add a comma here and say creates a person object. All right, so let's create a person object. Well, it's always going to be the name of our class. Our name of our class is person, and then so that's our type, and then we give it a name. So let's call this one Joe, and we're going to have Joe be equal to a value, right? Because I can just say person Joe, and if I did that, you notice we don't get any errors. But just like with variables, if we don't assign anything, it's not going to have any meaning. So I want to go ahead and equal a new person object and open close parentheses. And that, of course, would be enough to define Joe. So if we come down here and say, for example, let's say we're going to define the object. We're going to say Joe dot name. Let's give him his name first. Equals quote Joe. Pretty easy. And let's say Joe dot age equals, and let's give him age. Let's say he's 37. All right. So this, of course, is giving Joe a name and age, and then, of course, I could output him, right? So let's invoke the write output method. So we say Joe dot write output. And of course, if we were to run this, we would expect it to say Joe 37. So let's go ahead and run this. We get the person's name is Joe, the person's age is 37. Now, one thing that is cool about this is if I want to change this, so let's just say we're going to change Joe's age now. So we say Joe.age is now equal to, let's say, 21. We're going to make him younger here, make him feel good about himself. And then we go ahead and recall that write output method. What do you think his age is going to be? Is it still going to be that 37 that we had before, or is it now going to be the 21? Well, let's go ahead and give it a spin here, and you can see now it says Joe is 37, and then we, of course, have our second definition of age here, and it changed it to 21, and that overwrote that value that was here in person, which is pretty nifty. We actually don't have, notice there's no int or double or anything like that that's going on here in our main, because that's all being handled by this person class. In fact, I can create another person object in here. So let's say person, let's call them Sally. All right, and let's say Sally is going to be a new person, of course, because they're not the same as Joe. And we're going to say that Sally.name is equal to Sally. And let's set Sally's age equal to, let's make them 47. And all I need to do is call the write output method, and it should, of course, give me a different values than what we would expect to be in Joe. And sure enough, we can see we get Sally and 47. And that's all that's really to it. Now, there's going to be more nuance and more things that we're going to dive into, but I wanted to give you an example just to kind of get started here with looking at some of the different pieces that we have when we start working with classes. And at this point, you might be saying, okay, I could do all this with things in one class. I don't need to have a second class to do this. Then you're right. We could do this all in one class very easily. However, the reason we want to start using multiple classes is because there's going to be things that we're going to get into here that are actually going to be hugely beneficial for us to have an object-oriented approach than if we try to do it all in one class.